before the world even has the opportunity to speak to you, before messages appear on a screen or responsibilities begin to gather around your attention. Something inside your mind quietly speaks first. And most of the time, you do not notice that this voice has already begun shaping the entire landscape of your day. The first thought that rises when you wake is rarely dramatic, rarely loud, and rarely examined. Yet it carries a subtle authority over the body that hears it. A sentence forms in the darkness behind your eyes, sometimes so familiar that it feels like background noise rather than a decision. I'm already tired. This day will be difficult. I don't feel ready for anything. The moment that sentence appears, your brain treats it not as an opinion but as a command, and immediately it begins constructing a physiological environment that matches the meaning of the thought. Chemistry begins to shift before you even sit up in bed. Hormones associated with stress quietly enter the bloodstream. Your breathing shortens slightly. Your shoulders curve forward almost imperceptibly, and the nervous system begins organizing itself around the expectation of effort or resistance. Nothing external has occurred yet. No problem has appeared. No obstacle has presented itself. Yet your body has already begun preparing to endure a day that has not actually happened. The remarkable thing is that this process feels completely natural because it has been practiced thousands of times before. What you call waking up tired is often not the result of physical exhaustion at all. It is the result of the mind repeating a familiar signal that the body has learned to obey without hesitation. Consider the strange efficiency of the brain in this moment. It does not ask whether the thought is accurate. It does not evaluate whether the prediction deserves belief. The brain is not designed to debate the meaning of a thought. It is designed to translate thought into biology. Every idea that passes through the mind becomes electrical activity, and every pattern of electrical activity triggers chemical responses that travel through the body like instructions delivered to every cell. The brain's loyalty is extraordinary. It believes what you repeat. Now imagine a different beginning that occurs under identical circumstances. The same room, the same responsibilities waiting outside the door, the same body lying in the same bed. Yet instead of the old automatic phrase, another thought rises slowly through the quiet of waking consciousness. I'm grateful to be alive today. Perhaps the sentence is simple. Perhaps it feels unfamiliar at first. Yet the effect inside the body begins immediately. The breath deepens slightly without effort. The chest opens as though space has appeared inside the lungs. The nervous system relaxes its guard for a moment and allows a steadier rhythm to emerge. Nothing in the outside world has changed. Yet the internal environment has reorganized itself around a completely different instruction. The body does not wait for evidence before responding to the meaning of a thought. It trusts the mind more than it trusts circumstances. This is why two people can wake up in the same house, under the same pressures, facing the same day, yet live entirely different emotional realities from the very first hour. One moves through the morning with tension already circulating through the bloodstream, while the other moves through the same morning with a subtle sense of openness. The difference often begins with a single internal sentence spoken before consciousness has fully formed its usual defenses. Most people assume that the tone of their day is determined by what happens to them. Yet if you observe carefully, you may begin to notice something unusual. Long before events unfold, your mind has already decided what emotional climate the body will inhabit. Thoughts repeat themselves like old songs playing quietly in the background of awareness, and the body responds by releasing the chemistry that keeps the song playing. Over time, this becomes a loop so familiar that it feels like personality rather than programming. You say, "This is just how I am in the morning," without realizing that the brain has simply memorized the instructions it has received most often. The mind loves familiarity. From the brain's perspective, the safest environment is not necessarily the happiest one, but the most predictable one. If the first thoughts of the day have historically carried worry, fatigue, or anticipation of stress, the brain prepares the body for those conditions automatically because it assumes they are necessary for survival. The strange consequence is that people can begin their day defending themselves against challenges that have not yet appeared. Muscles tighten, attention narrows, energy drains before the real day even begins, and by midday it feels as though something exhausting has already occurred, even when the body has hardly moved. This pattern is not a sign of weakness, nor is it evidence that the mind is broken. It is simply a reflection of the brain's remarkable loyalty to repetition. Neurons that fire together repeatedly begin wiring together more efficiently. The same thought repeated day after day becomes easier for the brain to produce. Just as a path becomes clearer each time someone walks through the same field of grass. Eventually, the path becomes so established that the mind follows it automatically without noticing that alternative directions even exist. Yet, the same mechanism that builds the old pathway can also build a new one. A thought held with attention begins as a small electrical signal moving across neural networks. But if the signal appears often enough, it gradually forms a circuit. Circuits become patterns, and patterns become the habits that shape identity. What feels like who you are is often nothing more than the collection of thoughts that have been repeated long enough for the brain to recognize them instantly. This realization changes something subtle about the way you observe your own mind. Instead of assuming that your first thoughts each morning represent truth, you begin to see them as signals that have simply become familiar through practice. Some of them were learned years ago during stressful seasons of life. Others were absorbed quietly from environments where worry or urgency felt normal. The brain carried those patterns forward with perfect loyalty because that is what it was designed to do. Once you begin noticing the first thought that appears when you wake, something interesting happens. Awareness interrupts the automatic sequence. The mind pauses for a fraction of a second, as if realizing that someone is watching the process. In that pause, there is space, and within that space exists the possibility of choosing a different instruction. The change does not require force, and it does not demand that you pretend everything is perfect. It simply begins with the recognition that the brain is listening. Your mind speaks first each morning, and your body answers without argument. When that relationship becomes visible, waking up stops feeling like the start of another routine day and begins to feel more like standing at the quiet entrance of a landscape that has not yet fully formed. The light of the morning has barely arrived. The world has not yet begun to move, and for a brief moment the direction of the day still feels unwritten. Walk through any ordinary day, and you may begin to notice something curious about the way the mind behaves. Something so subtle that it hides beneath the noise of daily activity. A thought appears in the morning, perhaps a familiar concern, or a quiet worry about something unfinished. By midday, that thought has returned again, slightly rearranged but carrying the same emotional tone. By evening, it appears once more, this time disguised as reflection or analysis. The mind presents each occurrence as though it were new. Yet if you listen carefully, you begin to hear the echo inside it, the same idea repeating, the same emotional signature circling back. A quiet loop turning in the background of awareness. This loop is one of the most powerful and least recognized forces shaping human experience. Most people assume their thoughts arise spontaneously in response to the world around them. But in reality, the mind is far more conservative than it appears. It prefers familiar patterns because familiarity requires less energy. The brain is an organ designed for efficiency, and repetition is the most efficient strategy it knows. Once a thought has been practiced often enough, the neural pathways that carry it become smooth and automatic. The signal travels quickly, almost effortlessly, like water following a channel carved through soil by years of rainfall. Because of this efficiency, yesterday's thinking quietly becomes today's thinking without needing permission. The brain does not stop each morning to reconsider its beliefs. It simply resumes the patterns that were already active. If a person has spent months or years rehearsing doubt, the brain continues producing doubt with remarkable consistency. If someone has practiced anticipating conflict, the nervous system prepares for conflict even in peaceful environments. The mind is not deliberately creating difficulty. It is simply following the routes it knows best. What makes this process difficult to notice is the speed at which it happens. Thoughts move rapidly through the mind, and each one feels like a fresh reaction to the present moment. Yet beneath the surface, many of those reactions are actually memories repeating themselves. A worry that feels urgent today may be the same mental script that appeared last week and the week before that. The words may change slightly, but the emotional tone remains the same, like a melody played in different keys. Consider how easily a small concern can expand once it enters this loop. A simple uncertainty appears in the morning, perhaps about a conversation or a task waiting later in the day. The brain registers the uncertainty and searches its library of past experiences for similar situations. Within seconds, it retrieves memories of previous difficulties, moments when things did not go as planned, fragments of embarrassment or tension stored in emotional memory. Those memories color the present moment with the same emotional chemistry that once accompanied them. Suddenly, the mind is no longer responding only to what is happening now. It is responding to an entire archive of the past. The body participates in this process with perfect loyalty. Every repeated thought triggers chemical responses designed to match its meaning. If the mind repeatedly imagines threat, even a subtle or hypothetical threat, the body releases stress hormones that prepare muscles and attention for defense. If the mind repeatedly rehearses disappointment, the nervous system lowers energy as though protecting itself from further loss. These reactions become so consistent that they begin to feel like personality traits rather than biological responses. Over time, the loop strengthens itself. Thoughts generate emotions, emotions reinforce thoughts, and the cycle continues until the pattern becomes automatic. People often describe this experience as being stuck in their head, but what they are actually experiencing is the brain's habit of repeating the same mental instructions. The loop persists not because it is meaningful, but because it is familiar. Familiarity creates a strange form of comfort, even when the emotions involved are unpleasant. This is why individuals sometimes find themselves returning to the same worries even after circumstances have changed. A person might resolve a problem externally, yet continue thinking about it internally as though it were still present. The mind continues replaying the script because the neural pathway remains active. From the brain's perspective, repetition is proof that the thought is important. The more often a thought appears, the more authority it seems to carry. Unconscious repetition does something else that is even more significant. It narrows perception. When the mind expects a particular emotional outcome, it begins filtering experience in ways that confirm that expectation. A person who repeatedly anticipates criticism becomes highly sensitive to subtle cues in conversation. A person who repeatedly anticipates failure notices every small obstacle while overlooking opportunities that might contradict the narrative. The brain believes it is protecting the individual by predicting the future. Yet in reality, it is simply projecting the past onto the present. What is remarkable about this hidden loop is that it operates quietly beneath conscious intention. Most people do not deliberately choose to repeat the same thoughts. The repetition continues simply because awareness has not yet interrupted the cycle. The mind behaves like a machine left running overnight, continuing its activity even when no one is actively guiding it. Yet something interesting begins to happen the moment you observe the loop instead of participating in it. Observation introduces a pause into the system. A thought appears, but instead of immediately believing it, you notice its familiarity. You recognize that the same thought has visited before, perhaps many times. The recognition does not require you to suppress the thought or argue with it. It simply reveals that the thought is part of a pattern rather than a command that must be obeyed. This small shift in perspective changes the relationship between you and the mental loop. Instead of being carried along by the current of repetition, you begin to see the current itself. The mind may still produce the same ideas for a while, just as a river continues flowing along its established course. But awareness stands on the bank, observing the movement. That observation weakens the automatic authority of the pattern. Over time, the brain begins to adapt to this new condition. Neural circuits that were once strengthened by unconscious repetition now receive less reinforcement because awareness interrupts their momentum. The mind slowly becomes quieter in the spaces between thoughts. And within those spaces, new possibilities emerge. Thoughts that once felt inevitable begin to appear optional. Emotions that once seemed unavoidable reveal themselves as responses that can change when the underlying pattern changes. What was once a hidden loop becomes something visible, something that can be understood rather than feared. The mind is still active, still creative, still capable of producing countless ideas throughout the day. But the quiet repetition that once shaped every moment begins to lose its invisible control. Awareness does not silence the mind entirely, yet it transforms the experience of thinking from a cycle that runs on its own into a process that can be seen clearly as it unfolds. Stand quietly for a moment and consider something that may sound simple at first, yet becomes increasingly profound the longer you examine it. Your brain does not argue with you. It does not pause to debate the meaning of your thoughts, nor does it wait for evidence before translating them into chemistry and behavior. Instead, it behaves like a remarkably loyal instrument, responding to the instructions it receives from the mind that speaks through it. Every thought you repeat, every expectation you rehearse, every emotional tone you return to again and again becomes a signal that the brain interprets as guidance. Once the signal appears often enough, the brain begins organizing the body to match it. This loyalty is not a flaw in the design of the brain. It is one of its most extraordinary abilities. The brain is built to adapt quickly to the patterns that dominate your experience. If you repeatedly expose it to learning, it strengthens circuits associated with curiosity and focus. If you repeatedly expose it to tension, it strengthens circuits associated with vigilance and defense. In both cases, the brain is performing its task perfectly. It listens, it observes repetition, and then it reshapes its neural architecture to serve what it believes you want most often. Because of this obedience, the brain gradually becomes the physical reflection of the thoughts it hears most frequently. Neural pathways form where attention travels repeatedly. Synapses strengthen along routes that are used often and weaken along routes that remain quiet. Over time, this creates an internal landscape where certain thoughts move easily and others struggle to appear. The mind begins following the smoothest pathways simply because they require the least effort. And what began as a series of conscious choices slowly turns into automatic behavior. This process explains why people can feel trapped inside mental habits they never consciously intended to build. Someone who spends years anticipating criticism may eventually find that their brain automatically scans every conversation for signs of judgment. Another person who has spent years replaying past mistakes may notice that their mind returns to those memories even during moments when nothing is wrong. The brain is not deliberately producing these patterns. It is simply obeying instructions that were repeated often enough to become part of its wiring. What makes this obedience so powerful is the speed at which it operates. The brain processes signals faster than conscious awareness can evaluate them. When a familiar thought appears, the corresponding neural circuit activates almost instantly, triggering chemical responses that move through the body before the conscious mind has time to question the pattern. A memory surfaces, and within seconds the body begins producing the emotional chemistry associated with that memory. Muscles tense, breathing shifts, and attention narrows toward whatever the brain expects to encounter next. From the perspective of survival, this rapid response is extremely useful. It allows the body to react quickly to situations that resemble previous experiences of danger or difficulty. Yet in modern life, many of the signals that trigger this system are not actual threats but imagined scenarios or remembered stresses. The brain cannot easily distinguish between a real event and a vividly rehearsed thought. If the mind repeatedly imagines conflict, the brain prepares for conflict as faithfully as if the conflict were happening in the room. This is why the language you use in your own thoughts carries such influence. Phrases like, "I can't handle this" or "something will go wrong" are interpreted by the brain as instructions rather than commentary. The brain responds by adjusting the body to support the meaning of those statements. Stress hormones increase. Attention sharpens toward potential problems, and energy shifts toward defensive readiness. If those thoughts appear regularly, the brain eventually assumes that this defensive posture is necessary for daily life. Yet the same obedient nature of the brain that strengthens stress can also strengthen calm. When you repeatedly introduce thoughts that emphasize learning, patience, or gratitude, the brain begins building circuits that support those states as well. The process may feel slower at first because the pathways associated with tension are already well established. But the principle remains exactly the same. The brain observes repetition, strengthens the circuits involved, and gradually reshapes its chemistry to match the signals it receives. Think of the brain as a musical instrument responding to the notes that are played through it. If the same melody is performed day after day, the instrument becomes tuned to that melody. Certain strings vibrate more easily. Certain harmonies emerge automatically. And the music begins to sound natural simply because it has been practiced repeatedly. When a new melody appears, the instrument may hesitate at first, but with consistent practice, the new pattern eventually becomes just as familiar as the old one. This analogy reveals something important about personal change. Transformation rarely occurs through sudden declarations or brief moments of motivation. The brain does not reorganize itself because of a single inspiring thought. It reorganizes itself because of repeated signals delivered over time. Each time a new thought appears and is held with attention, a small electrical event occurs inside the neural network. When that event repeats frequently enough, it begins strengthening the connections that support it. Gradually, those connections form circuits, and circuits form habits of thinking and feeling. The brain, faithful to its design, begins producing those patterns automatically because it has learned that they are important. What once required deliberate effort becomes easier, and eventually it becomes natural. This is how the obedient instrument of the brain learns new music. There is something quietly empowering about recognizing this process. Instead of seeing the brain as an unpredictable source of thoughts and emotions, you begin to understand it as a responsive system waiting for direction. It listens constantly to the signals you provide through attention and repetition. When those signals change, the brain adapts, neural pathways shift, chemical patterns evolve, and the body begins expressing a different internal environment. None of this requires perfection or constant control over every thought. The brain does not demand flawless instructions. What it responds to most strongly is consistency. When certain patterns appear again and again, they gradually outweigh older ones that it used less often. Over time, the obedient instrument begins playing a different tune, not because it was forced to change, but because it faithfully followed the signals it heard most clearly. Recognizing the brain's obedience does not eliminate the complexity of human experience. Yet it reveals a deeper relationship between thought and biology. The brain listens, interprets repetition as importance, and shapes the body to match the story that the mind continues telling. When that relationship becomes visible, thinking no longer feels like random noise passing through the mind. It begins to resemble a quiet dialogue with the most responsive instrument you possess, one that continues adjusting itself to the patterns it hears every day. There are days when the body feels tense long before anything stressful has actually happened. Moments when your shoulders are already tight, your breathing slightly shallow, and your mind scanning the horizon for problems that have not yet appeared. It can feel mysterious at first, as if the tension arrived without invitation. Yet when you look closely at the way the brain and body work together, a quiet pattern begins to reveal itself. Stress often feels like a reaction to circumstances, but in many cases, it is something the body has learned to reproduce automatically. A familiar chemical rhythm circulating through the nervous system because it has been rehearsed so many times before. The body is not simply a collection of muscles and organs responding to the world moment by moment. It is also a vast memory system, storing the chemical traces of past experiences and learning how to recreate those internal conditions with remarkable precision. When a person repeatedly encounters stressful situations, the brain releases specific hormones designed to help the body respond quickly. Adrenaline increases alertness, cortisol mobilizes energy, and the nervous system shifts into a state of heightened vigilance. These chemical reactions are extremely useful when real danger is present, allowing the body to act quickly and decisively. The difficulty arises when the brain continues producing the same chemistry even after the original danger has disappeared. Over time, the body becomes accustomed to this chemical environment. Cells throughout the body begin adapting to the presence of stress hormones circulating regularly through the bloodstream. Receptors in the nervous system grow more sensitive to those signals, and the entire biological system gradually adjusts itself to operate within that elevated state of tension. What once occurred only during moments of genuine threat begins to appear during ordinary situations. A conversation, a deadline, a crowded street, even a quiet moment alone with one's thoughts. The chemistry of stress becomes familiar, and familiarity has a powerful influence on biological systems. This familiarity can create a surprising effect. The body begins expecting the chemical signals it has learned to recognize. Just as the brain becomes efficient at repeating certain thoughts, the body becomes efficient at producing certain emotional states. When stress hormones have circulated frequently enough, the body starts anticipating their presence, almost as though it has grown comfortable with the intensity they bring. In this way, stress can become a learned pattern rather than a purely situational reaction. Imagine a person who has spent years operating in a demanding environment where constant alertness was necessary. During that period, the brain repeatedly instructed the body to prepare for pressure. Muscles tightened regularly, attention sharpened toward potential problems, and the bloodstream carried a steady supply of hormones designed to sustain high levels of activity. When the environment eventually changes, the body does not instantly forget those instructions. The neural circuits responsible for producing stress chemistry remain active because they have been reinforced through repetition. The person may now live in a calmer situation, Yet the body continues generating the same chemical signals simply because it has learned to do so. This is one reason why people sometimes feel restless or uneasy, even when nothing external appears to justify those feelings. The nervous system has memorized a pattern that once served a purpose, and it continues repeating that pattern automatically. The brain interprets the body's chemical state as evidence that something must be wrong, which then produces thoughts that match the feeling. Those thoughts reinforce the stress response, creating a loop in which biology and psychology continually confirm each other. The cycle can become remarkably convincing. When the body releases stress hormones, the mind interprets the sensation as anxiety or urgency. The mind then searches the environment for explanations that justify the feeling. Perhaps there is an upcoming responsibility, an unresolved conversation, or a small uncertainty about the future. The mind attaches itself to that possibility and begins analyzing it repeatedly. Each new thought triggers another wave of stress chemistry, strengthening the original sensation. In this way, the body and mind collaborate in maintaining a pattern that feels inevitable, even though it began as a learned response. What makes this process particularly powerful is that the body often reacts faster than conscious awareness. The chemical shift occurs within seconds of a triggering thought or memory, sometimes before the person has even recognized the thought itself. By the time awareness catches up, the body is already experiencing the physical sensations of tension, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, tightened muscles, and heightened alertness. Because these sensations feel immediate and real, they appear to confirm that something external must be causing them. Yet if you observe the process carefully, you may notice that the body sometimes enters this state without any clear external cause. The chemistry of stress can arise simply because the brain has grown accustomed to producing it. The pattern operates quietly beneath conscious intention, repeating itself whenever the mind touches familiar emotional territory. What appears to be a reaction to the present moment may actually be the body replaying an old chemical script learned in the past. Recognizing this possibility changes the way stress is understood. Instead of seeing tension solely as a response to circumstances, you begin to see it as a learned biological pattern that can be unlearned through new experiences. The brain remains obedient to repetition, and the body remains responsive to the signals it receives from the brain. When new patterns of thought and breathing begin appearing regularly, the nervous system gradually adjusts its chemistry to match those signals. For example, when the body experience is slow, steady breathing, accompanied by a calm mental state, different chemical messengers begin circulating through the bloodstream. The parasympathetic nervous system activates, lowering heart rate and reducing the production of stress hormones. Cells that were accustomed to adrenaline and cortisol start responding to signals associated with relaxation and restoration. The biological environment shifts, sometimes subtly at first, but steadily with repetition. This shift does not require eliminating all stress from life, which would be impossible and unnecessary. Instead, it involves teaching the nervous system that calm states can also become familiar. Just as stress once became a learned chemical pattern through repetition, a different pattern can develop when the brain repeatedly signals safety, patience, and clarity. Over time, the body learns to recognize these signals as equally valid instructions. When that learning begins to take hold, something interesting happens. Situations that once triggered immediate tension begin to feel slightly different. The body pauses for a moment before launching into its old chemical routine, as though reconsidering whether the familiar pattern is still required. In that pause, there is space for a new response, one that does not automatically follow the script written by past experiences. Stress, then, is not always the unavoidable result of modern life. Often it is the echo of earlier patterns that the brain and body learn through repetition. Once those patterns become visible, the possibility of reshaping them begins to emerge. The chemistry circulating through the body is no longer seen as a permanent condition, but as a dynamic process, responding to signals that can gradually change with awareness and consistent practice. There comes a quiet moment in the process of understanding the mind when something important begins to shift. You start realizing that many of the thoughts moving through your head are not random visitors at all. They are habits, echoes of previous patterns repeating themselves because they have been practiced long enough to become automatic. At first, this realization can feel slightly unsettling, because it suggests that much of what once felt spontaneous is actually conditioned. Yet within that recognition lies a surprising freedom, because the moment you see a pattern clearly, you are no longer completely inside it. You are standing just outside the current, observing the direction it flows. And once you are standing there, something subtle becomes possible. You can begin redirecting the current. The brain, as we have already seen, behaves like a remarkably obedient instrument. It does not question repeated signals, it organizes itself around them. This means that the same mechanism that once strengthened unhelpful patterns can also strengthen new ones when you introduce them deliberately. The difference between unconscious repetition and conscious redirection is not force, intensity, or even motivation. The difference is awareness combined with consistent instruction. Think of attention as a form of guidance. Wherever attention lingers, electrical activity follows. Neurons fire along pathways associated with whatever the mind is focusing on. When the same pathway activates repeatedly, the brain strengthens it through a process known as long-term potentiation, gradually making that route easier and faster for signals to travel. In other words, attention is not passive observation. It is a biological instruction telling the brain which circuits deserve reinforcement. When thoughts arise automatically, attention often follows them without question. A worry appears, and the mind begins analyzing it. A memory surfaces, and the mind begins replaying it. Within moments, attention is fully absorbed in the pattern, strengthening the very circuit that produced it. The process feels natural because the brain has practiced it so many times. Conscious redirection begins with noticing this moment before it completes its usual cycle. Imagine a thought appearing that you have seen many times before. Perhaps a familiar doubt or a quiet criticism of yourself. In the past, that thought might have expanded into a long internal conversation, generating emotions that matched its tone. Now, instead of automatically following it, you pause for a moment and simply recognize it. You see the thought as a signal rather than a truth that must be explored. This pause is small, often lasting only a few seconds, yet biologically it is extremely significant. During that pause, the brain is not receiving the reinforcement it expects. The usual chain reaction of thoughts and emotions does not fully activate. The circuit weakens slightly because the pattern was interrupted before it could complete its loop. In that brief opening, you introduce a new instruction. The instruction does not need to be dramatic or overly positive. In fact, exaggerated affirmations often fail because the brain recognizes them as inconsistent with the person's current emotional state. Effective redirection works best when the new thought feels plausible, grounded, and aligned with learning rather than denial. For example, instead of saying, "Nothing will ever go wrong," which the brain may reject immediately, you might say something quieter but still powerful. "I'm learning to handle this situation more calmly." That sentence carries a different emotional tone. It does not deny reality, yet it shifts the direction of attention toward growth and stability. The brain receives the signal and begins adjusting its chemistry accordingly. This is how conscious commands reshape the nervous system. Each time the new instruction appears, the brain begins forming connections that support it. At first, those connections are fragile because they have not yet been used frequently. The old pathways remain stronger simply because they have been reinforced for longer periods of time. But with repetition, the balance begins to change. The new pattern gains strength each time attention rests upon it. An interesting thing happens as this process continues. The emotional environment of the body begins shifting as well. Thoughts are not isolated events inside the brain. They trigger cascades of chemical signals that travel throughout the entire nervous system. When attention repeatedly returns to thoughts associated with patience, curiosity, or gratitude, the brain releases neurotransmitters and hormones that correspond with those states. Serotonin and oxytocin increase, calming the stress response and stabilizing mood. Over time, the body begins associating these chemicals with the new patterns of thought. What once felt unfamiliar gradually becomes comfortable. The nervous system learns that calmness does not require extraordinary circumstances. It can exist within ordinary moments when attention is guided intentionally. This is why small, consistent instructions are often more effective than large declarations. The brain is sensitive to repetition, not drama. A single inspiring idea may create temporary motivation, but unless that idea becomes part of daily mental activity, it will not reorganize neural circuits in lasting ways. Conscious commands work through rhythm rather than intensity. You can see this principle in simple practices that influence attention throughout the day. A person who pauses occasionally to take slow, steady breaths is quietly teaching the brain that moments of stillness belong within the flow of activity. Someone who deliberately acknowledges small moments of gratitude is instructing the brain to search for signals of safety rather than signals of threat. Each of these actions sends electrical messages through the nervous system that gradually reshape how the brain interprets experience. None of this requires constant monitoring of every thought. The mind naturally produces thousands of ideas throughout the day, many of which pass quickly without influence. What matters most is the pattern you return to most often. If awareness repeatedly guides attention toward clarity and steadiness, the brain eventually begins producing those states more easily on its own. This transformation rarely feels dramatic while it is unfolding. Instead, it appears as subtle changes in the rhythm of daily life. Situations that once triggered immediate frustration may now evoke a moment of reflection before the reaction forms. Thoughts that previously dominated your attention may appear briefly and then fade without expanding into long internal narratives. The mind becomes less like a storm and more like a landscape, where different weather patterns move through without controlling the entire sky. Redirecting the mind through conscious commands does not eliminate the complexity of life, nor does it guarantee that every moment will feel calm. Challenges still arise, emotions still fluctuate, and unexpected events still occur. Yet within that changing environment, there is now a guiding influence. A quiet voice of intention that gently steers attention rather than letting it drift entirely according to old habits. The obedient brain continues listening as it always has, responding faithfully to the signals it receives. But now those signals are no longer shaped solely by unconscious repetition. They are gradually influenced by deliberate choices made in small moments of awareness. With each repetition, the brain learns that the direction of thought is not fixed by the past. It can shift, slowly but steadily, whenever attention returns to the path you are choosing to strengthen. Close your eyes for a moment and consider something that usually passes unnoticed. Every thought you experience begins as a pulse of electricity. It does not arrive as a solid object or a visible force. It begins as a tiny electrical event inside the vast network of neurons that make up your brain. One neuron sends a signal. Another receives it. Chemicals bridge the space between them, and within a fraction of a second, an idea appears in your awareness. It feels intangible, almost weightless. Yet behind that quiet experience lies a complex storm of electrical activity moving through billions of neural connections. What makes this process remarkable is that it never stops. Even when you believe you are resting, the brain continues, sending electrical impulses through its circuits, shaping perception, memory, imagination, and emotion. The brain operates on electricity in much the same way a city operates on power flowing through its grid. Signals travel constantly, illuminating different areas depending on where attention is directed. When attention focuses on a thought, the electrical activity associated with that thought intensifies. Neurons fire together in rhythmic patterns, strengthening the connections that allow the signal to travel again in the future. Because of this electrical nature, thoughts are not passive experiences. They are active events that influence the entire body. Every time a neural circuit fires, it sends chemical messengers into the bloodstream that carry instructions to organs, muscles, and glands. A thought of safety releases different chemicals than a thought of danger. A thought of gratitude activates different systems than a thought of resentment. The electrical activity in the brain becomes biological movement throughout the body. Scientists have long observed this phenomenon through measurements of brain waves. Electroencephalography, or EEG, records the electrical rhythms produced by neural activity. These rhythms change depending on what the mind is doing. When a person is highly alert or anxious, the brain often produces fast, irregular beta waves associated with intense mental processing. When the mind becomes calm and focused, slower alpha waves appear, reflecting a status of relaxed attention. During deep meditation or sleep, even slower theta and delta waves emerge, indicating profound levels of internal synchronization. These electrical patterns reveal something essential about thought. The mind does not merely interpret reality. It generates a dynamic field of activity that interacts continuously with the body's systems. Each thought is like a spark moving through an immense network of circuits. Some sparks fade quickly, leaving little trace, Others ignite pathways that remain active long enough to influence how the body feels, how emotions unfold, and how the next thought emerges. Consider how a single memory can instantly change the atmosphere within your body. Perhaps you recall a moment of embarrassment from years ago. Within seconds, your face may grow warm, your stomach tightens slightly, and your breathing becomes shallower. Nothing in the external environment has changed. The room remains the same. The people around you remain the same. Yet the body reacts as if the event were happening again. The electrical signal of the thought has triggered chemical responses that recreate the emotional state associated with that memory. This interaction between electrical signals and chemical reactions forms the basis of how the mind shapes physical experience. Neurons communicate through both electricity and chemistry, sending signals that ripple outward from the brain to every system in the body. Hormones are released, muscles receive instructions, and the immune system adjusts its activity. The body is constantly listening to the brain's electrical language. Because the brain is always active, the question is not whether thoughts influence the body, but which thoughts are most frequently shaping that influence. When certain patterns dominate attention, their electrical signatures repeat often enough to strengthen the circuits that produce them. Over time, those circuits become the brain's preferred routes, guiding the flow of neural activity in familiar directions. This is why repetitive thinking has such a profound impact on emotional life. If the brain repeatedly generates thoughts of worry, the electrical patterns associated with those thoughts become easier to activate. The neural pathway grows efficient. Like a well-traveled road, when a new situation arises, the brain naturally follows the road it knows best, producing the same type of thought even if the circumstances are different. Yet the same principle also allows new patterns to develop. When attention deliberately focuses on calmer or more constructive thoughts, different neural circuits activate. At first, these circuits may feel unfamiliar or even slightly uncomfortable because they have not yet been reinforced. But each time the electrical signal travels through them, the pathway becomes clearer. Over time, the brain begins recognizing this route as another viable option. The electrical nature of thought also explains why attention carries such influence. Attention determines where electrical energy flows within the brain. Wherever attention lingers, neurons fire more frequently, strengthening the connections involved. In this way, attention acts like a conductor, directing the movement of electricity through the neural network. By choosing where to place attention, you indirectly guide the development of the brain's circuitry. This guidance does not require constant effort. The brain is extraordinarily responsive to patterns that repeat with moderate consistency. A few moments each day spent focusing on calm breathing, appreciation, or curiosity can introduce new electrical rhythms that gradually influence the larger system. When those rhythms repeat often enough, the brain begins generating them more easily, integrating them into the background activity of the mind. Over time, the electrical landscape of the brain becomes more balanced. Fast, chaotic signals associated with stress appear less frequently, while slower, more coherent patterns associated with clarity and focus become easier to sustain. The nervous system begins operating with greater stability because the electrical traffic moving through it follows more harmonious pathways. Seen from this perspective, thinking is not merely a mental habit, it is an energetic process occurring within a living biological system. Each thought contributes a small electrical event to the overall pattern of neural activity. Individually, these events may seem insignificant, but collectively they shape the rhythm of the mind and the chemistry of the body. When you begin recognizing thoughts as electrical signals rather than unquestioned truths, the relationship with the mind subtly changes. Instead of feeling carried along by every idea that appears, you can observe how attention energizes certain circuits and allows others to quiet down. The mind continues producing thoughts as it always has, yet awareness gradually becomes the place from which those electrical movements can be noticed without immediately amplifying them. Within that awareness, the flow of neural energy becomes easier to understand. Signals travel through pathways that have been strengthened by repetition, yet those pathways remain flexible because the brain continues adapting to new patterns of attention. The electrical life of the mind is constantly moving, constantly adjusting, responding faithfully to the signals it receives from the focus you bring to each moment. Walk into a room where two people have just finished arguing, and even before anyone says a word, you can feel that something in the atmosphere is tense. The air seems heavier. Your body becomes slightly alert. You may not know what happened, yet some part of you instantly recognizes that the emotional climate of the room has changed. Now imagine entering a different room where someone has just shared good news, or where people are quietly relaxed and content, without being told anything. Your shoulders soften and your breathing settles. In both situations, nothing physical in the environment has dramatically shifted. Yet something invisible is clearly present. What you are sensing in moments like these is not imagination. Human beings continuously transmit and perceive emotional signals through the nervous system. Every emotion that moves through the body carries with it a pattern of electrical activity in the brain and chemical responses in the heart and hormones. Together, these processes generate subtle changes in the electromagnetic field surrounding the body. Though invisible, these signals are constantly interacting with other living systems around us. Your emotional state, therefore, does more than influence your internal experience. It quietly broadcasts a pattern that other nervous systems can perceive. The brain and heart communicate with the body using electrical and magnetic signals, and these signals extend beyond the skin in measurable ways. Researchers studying the heart's electromagnetic field have found that it can extend several feet beyond the body, carrying information about the rhythms of your emotional state. When those rhythms are calm and coherent, they influence the nervous systems of others differently than when they are chaotic or tense. This is one reason emotional states spread so easily within groups. A single anxious person can create an atmosphere where others begin feeling uneasy without understanding why. The same phenomenon occurs in positive environments, where calm individuals seem to stabilize everyone around them. Emotional frequency moves through social spaces quietly, shaping how people interpret and respond to each other. Yet the influence of emotional frequency extends even further than interpersonal interactions. It also shapes the way you interpret events and opportunities in your own life. Emotions act like filters that tune your perception toward certain possibilities while ignoring others. When the body is filled with tension or fear, attention becomes narrow. The brain focuses primarily on signals that confirm potential threats. Small difficulties appear larger, and ambiguous situations are interpreted in defensive ways. When the body is filled with calm or gratitude, perception expands. The brain becomes more open to subtle opportunities, creative ideas, and connections between events that might otherwise pass unnoticed. This shift does not occur because reality itself has changed, but because the emotional state of the observer influences how information is processed. Think of emotional frequency as a kind of internal tuning system. Just as a radio receives certain stations depending on the frequency it is set to, the human nervous system becomes more responsive to experiences that resonate with its current emotional state. A person who spends most of their time expecting disappointment often notices evidence that supports that expectation. A person who approaches situations with curiosity and openness tends to notice possibilities that align with those emotions. This does not mean that emotions magically control the external world, nor does it suggest that every outcome can be determined through positive thinking alone. Reality remains complex and influenced by countless factors. However, emotional frequency strongly influences the way individuals interact with those factors. It shapes attention, decision-making, and the interpretation of events, all of which influence the direction life takes over time. Consider how emotional patterns influence communication. Someone who approaches a conversation with suspicion often speaks and listens differently than someone who approaches the same conversation with openness. Tone of voice shifts, body language tightens, and subtle signals of distrust appear even if the person does not intend them. The other person senses those signals and responds accordingly, often reinforcing the original expectation. What began as an internal emotional state gradually shapes the external interaction. This dynamic illustrates how emotional broadcasting can influence outcomes without requiring any mysterious forces. Your internal state guides how you speak, move, and interpret situations. Those behaviors influence how others respond, which then feeds back into your perception of reality. Over time, the cycle creates experiences that appear to confirm the emotional tone you carried into the situation. Because emotional states influence perception so strongly, changing emotional frequency can gradually alter the experiences that become most common in your life. When the nervous system spends more time in calm, coherent states, the brain begins interpreting events with greater clarity. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. Conversations unfold differently because the body is not constantly preparing for conflict. Opportunities that once seemed invisible begin to appear simply because attention is no longer focused entirely on defense. The shift toward coherent emotional frequency often begins with simple practices that regulate the nervous system. Slow breathing, moments of stillness, and deliberate attention to positive experiences all influence the rhythm of the heart and brain. When these rhythms become synchronized, the body enters a state sometimes referred to as physiological coherence. In this state, the nervous system operates more efficiently, allowing energy to flow toward creativity and problem-solving rather than constant vigilance. With repeated practice, the brain begins recognizing this coherent state as a desirable baseline. Stressful reactions still occur when necessary, but they no longer dominate everyday experience. The emotional field surrounding the body becomes more stable, broadcasting signals of balance rather than tension. People often notice that interactions with others change subtly during this process. Conversations become smoother, misunderstandings decrease, and moments of connection appear more frequently. These changes do not happen instantly, and they rarely appear dramatic at first. Instead, they accumulate gradually as emotional habits shift. Each time the nervous system returns to a calmer rhythm, the brain records the experience and strengthens the circuits associated with it. Over weeks and months, those circuits begin activating more easily, allowing the body to maintain coherence even during challenging situations. Eventually, the emotional frequency you broadcast becomes less dependent on circumstances and more influenced by your internal regulation. Situations that once triggered immediate anxiety may now evoke a brief pause before the reaction forms. Within that pause, there is space to respond rather than react. And that difference alters the entire trajectory of the interaction. What began as a subtle adjustment in emotional rhythm gradually reshapes the way reality is experienced. The world may still present challenges and uncertainty, yet the internal signals you broadcast into each moment become steadier, more balanced, and more intentional. Within that steadiness, the relationship between inner experience and outer events begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a continuous conversation between the state you hold within and the life unfolding around you. Most people believe that thinking happens only in the brain. That idea seems obvious because thoughts appear inside the mind, and we naturally assume the brain is the single center of control. Yet when researchers began studying the human nervous system more closely, they discovered something surprising. The heart is not merely a mechanical pump moving blood through the body. The heart has its own complex network of neurons, sometimes called the heart brain, and this network communicates continuously with the brain in the head. In fact, signals traveling from the heart to the brain are often stronger and more influential than the signals traveling the other way around. This discovery changes the way we understand emotional experience. When the heart sends signals to the brain, it influences perception, decision-making, and emotional stability. The rhythm of the heart becomes a kind of language that the brain interprets. When that rhythm is chaotic and irregular, the brain receives signals associated with stress or instability. When the rhythm becomes smooth and coherent, the brain interprets the signals as safety and balance. You can observe this phenomenon in moments of intense stress. When someone feels overwhelmed by worry, anger, or fear, the heartbeat becomes erratic. The intervals between beats vary unpredictably. This pattern is called heart rate variability. And, during emotional turmoil, the variability becomes disordered. The brain receives this chaotic signal and interprets it as a sign that something is wrong. In response, the brain activates stress responses that increase vigilance, narrow attention, and release hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. The result is a feedback loop. Emotional stress creates irregular heart rhythms. The irregular rhythms signal the brain that danger may be present. The brain intensifies stress reactions, which further disturb the heart rhythm. Within this loop, the mind becomes crowded with racing thoughts, and the body feels tense or restless. Many people live in this cycle without realizing how deeply the heart's rhythm influences the mind's stability. But the same system that creates chaos can also create coherence. Heart-brain coherence occurs when the rhythm of the heart becomes smooth, stable, and synchronized with breathing and neural activity. Instead of erratic spikes and irregular intervals, the heartbeat follows a consistent wave-like pattern. When the brain receives this pattern, it interprets it as a signal of physiological safety. The nervous system begins shifting from the stress-driven sympathetic mode into the calmer parasympathetic state. In this state, several changes occur simultaneously. Breathing deepens naturally, blood pressure stabilizes, muscles relax. The brain's electrical patterns move towards slower, more organized rhythms. Cognitive clarity improves because the brain is no longer devoting most of its resources to scanning for threats. Creativity, intuition, and problem-solving abilities become more accessible because the nervous system has space to operate beyond survival mode. One of the simplest ways to enter heart-brain coherence is through the regulation of breath. Slow, rhythmic breathing, particularly inhaling and exhaling at a steady pace, directly influences the heart's rhythm. As breathing becomes more regular, the heart gradually synchronizes with that rhythm. The brain then receives coherent signals from the heart and begins adjusting its own activity accordingly. Another pathway to coherence involves emotional focus. When a person deliberately brings attention to feelings such as gratitude, appreciation, or compassion, the heart rhythm naturally becomes more ordered. These emotions appear to stimulate neural circuits that harmonize the heart's electrical patterns. Within a few minutes, the body can move from a state of internal turbulence to one of calm alignment. You may have experienced this shift without realizing what was happening. Perhaps you were feeling overwhelmed, then paused to step outside, breathe slowly, and reflect on something meaningful in your life. Gradually, the tension faded. The situation around you might not have changed, yet your perception of it became clearer and less reactive. What occurred in that moment was not simply psychological relaxation. Your heart and brain began communicating through a coherent rhythm. This coherence has practical effects beyond emotional calm. When the nervous system is synchronized, the brain processes information more efficiently. Reaction times improve. Memory becomes more reliable. Even the immune system benefits because chronic stress hormones begin decreasing when the body spends more time in coherent states. Interestingly, coherence also appears to influence social interactions. Humans unconsciously detect the emotional states of others through subtle cues such as facial expressions, posture, tone of voice, and even micro-changes in physiological rhythms. A person who is internally coherent often communicates a sense of stability that others respond to instinctively. Conversations become less defensive, and cooperation becomes easier because the nervous systems of those involved are not constantly reacting to signals of threat. This does not mean coherence eliminates all stress. Life continues presenting challenges, and the nervous system will still activate protective responses when necessary. The difference is that coherent individuals recover from stress more quickly. Instead of remaining trapped in prolonged cycles of tension, the body returns to balance sooner because the heart and brain maintain a more harmonious relationship. Developing this balance is not about forcing the mind into constant positivity. Rather, it involves training the nervous system to recognize calm rhythms and return to them regularly. Simple daily practices, slow breathing, moments of appreciation, mindful pauses throughout the day, gradually teach the heart and brain how to synchronize more easily. At first, the experience may feel subtle. The mind may still wander, and the body may occasionally fall back into familiar stress patterns, but each moment spent in coherence leaves a trace within the nervous system. Neural pathways supporting calm awareness strengthen little by little. Over time, the body begins remembering this state more quickly, almost like a musical instrument learning to return to the correct pitch after being slightly out of tune. As this process unfolds, the difference between inner chaos and inner coherence becomes clearer. Chaos feels like constant mental noise, thoughts colliding, emotions shifting rapidly, the body reacting before awareness can intervene. Coherence feels different. The mind remains active, but its movements are smoother and more deliberate. Thoughts appear and pass without pulling the entire nervous system into turbulence. In that quieter internal environment, perception also changes. Situations that once seemed overwhelming become easier to observe calmly. Decisions arise from clarity rather than urgency. The body remains responsive to life's demands, yet it no longer carries the continuous tension of unresolved stress. This shift does not happen overnight, nor does it require perfection. The nervous system learns gradually. Adjusting its rhythms each time, attention returns to calm breathing and balanced emotion. With enough repetition, the heart and brain begin working together more consistently, transforming the internal atmosphere from scattered noise into a steady pattern of communication that supports clarity, stability, and awareness. Imagine sitting in a room where 10 radios are playing at the same time. Each one broadcasts a different station. None of them are synchronized. One voice speaks loudly about problems. Another whispers memories from the past. Another predicts future worries, while several others repeat fragments of unfinished conversations. After a few minutes, the noise becomes exhausting. You cannot clearly hear any single message because the signals overlap constantly. The mind becomes restless simply trying to process the confusion. Now consider something quietly revealing. For many people, this description is not far from the way their mind operates every day. The human brain is an extraordinary instrument, capable of processing vast amounts of information, adapting to new environments, and coordinating the complex functions of the body. Yet, like any biological system, it also has limits. Neural circuits require energy to function. Every thought consumes glucose and oxygen. Every decision activates networks of neurons that must communicate through electrical signals and chemical exchanges. When the brain operates with clarity and focus, this energy is used efficiently. But when the mind becomes filled with constant internal noise, the system begins wasting enormous amounts of its resources. Mental noise often takes the form of continuous background thinking that serves no immediate purpose. The brain replays conversations that already ended, imagines arguments that may never happen, predicts problems that may never arrive, and analyzes situations that cannot be changed in that moment. Each of these thoughts triggers neural activity as if the brain was solving a real problem. The circuits fire, chemicals are released, and energy is consumed, yet the result rarely produces a useful outcome. Over time, this pattern creates something researchers sometimes describe as neural fatigue. Neural fatigue occurs when the brain's networks remain active for long periods without meaningful rest or resolution. Unlike physical fatigue, which can often be felt clearly in the muscles, neural fatigue is more subtle. It may appear as difficulty concentrating, irritability, forgetfulness, or a vague sense that the mind feels overloaded. The brain continues operating, but its efficiency declines because the circuits responsible for attention and decision-making have been overused. This phenomenon becomes easier to understand when you consider the brain's energy demands. Although the brain represents only about 2% of the body's weight, it consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy supply. Neurons require constant fuel to maintain electrical activity and maintain the delicate balance of ions that allows signals to travel through neural networks. When thoughts fire continuously without pause, the brain must work harder to maintain this activity. Mental noise intensifies this energy consumption because the brain treats imagined scenarios almost as seriously as real ones. When you replay a stressful conversation in your mind, the brain activates many of the same circuits that were active during the original event. Stress hormones may even be released again, preparing the body for a threat that is no longer present. In effect, the brain relives the experience repeatedly, each time consuming energy that could otherwise support focus, creativity, or recovery. The nervous system was never designed to remain in such a constant state of internal activity. In earlier periods of human history, intense mental focus was usually tied to immediate survival situations, finding food, navigating unfamiliar terrain, or responding to physical danger. These situations required bursts of attention followed by periods of rest when the body could recover. Modern life often disrupts this rhythm. The mind receives a continuous stream of information from digital devices, conversations, responsibilities, and expectations. Even when the body is physically still, the mind may continue processing multiple streams of thought simultaneously. Without intentional pauses, the brain rarely experiences the quiet intervals that allow neural circuits to reset. When mental noise persists for long periods, several changes begin occurring within the nervous system. Stress hormones such as cortisol may remain elevated, keeping the body in a mild but continuous state of alertness. The prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, reasoning, and self-control, becomes less effective because it is constantly competing with emotional circuits that signal potential threats. Sleep may become less restorative because the brain remains active even during moments meant for recovery. This is why individuals experiencing chronic mental noise often report feeling tired even after a full night of sleep. The body may have rested physically, yet the mind continued processing thoughts late into the night. Neural circuits remained active instead of entering the deeper restorative rhythms that help repair the brain's energy systems. Yet the brain also possesses a remarkable ability to restore balance when given the opportunity. One of the most effective ways to reduce neural fatigue is surprisingly simple, allowing moments when the mind is not actively solving problems or replaying scenarios. During these quiet intervals, the brain's default mode network, a system associated with introspection and self-reflection, becomes less dominant. Other neural networks responsible for sensory awareness and present-moment attention become more active. This shift reduces the endless internal commentary that drains energy. Practices such as mindful breathing, brief periods of silence, or simply focusing attention on the physical sensations of the body can interrupt the cycle of mental noise. When attention rests on the rhythm of breathing or the feeling of the feet touching the ground, the brain temporarily steps out of analytical processing. Neural circuits responsible for rumination begin slowing down. The nervous system shifts towards states associated with restoration. Even short pauses can have significant effects. A few minutes of quiet breathing allows oxygen levels in the brain to stabilize, helps regulate heart rhythms, and reduces the release of stress hormones. Neural circuits that have been firing continuously begin to slow their activity, conserving energy and allowing the brain to recover. Over time, these pauses accumulate into meaningful changes in how the mind operates. The brain gradually learns that it does not need to analyze every thought that appears. Some thoughts can pass without engagement, just as clouds move across the sky without altering the landscape beneath them. As this understanding deepens, the background noise of the mind begins to decrease. The absence of constant noise reveals something many people have not experienced in years: mental clarity. When fewer circuits compete for attention, the brain can concentrate more effectively on the task at hand. Decisions become easier because the mind is not overwhelmed by unnecessary information. Creativity often improves because neural resources are available for exploring new ideas rather than replaying old ones. Neural fatigue, therefore, teaches an important lesson about the cost of unregulated thinking. The mind may appear limitless in its ability to generate ideas, yet the biological system supporting those ideas requires balance. When thoughts move continuously without rest, the brain eventually signals that it needs a different rhythm. Within that signal lies an invitation to rediscover quiet intervals where neural energy can gather itself again. In those intervals, the brain gradually recovers from the strain of constant activity, and the mind begins operating with a steadiness that feels both lighter and more focused than the endless noise that once filled every moment. Stand in the middle of a forest very early in the morning, before people begin moving through the day, before engines start and conversations rise into the air, and something unusual becomes noticeable. The world is not truly empty of sound. Leaves move slightly. Distant birds shift in the branches. The wind travels through spaces between trees. Yet beneath those small movements there is a wide quietness that holds everything together. That quietness does not demand attention, but it allows every sound to exist without conflict. The human mind has a similar relationship with silence, although many people rarely experience it anymore. Thoughts move constantly, reacting to memories, expectations, responsibilities, and countless fragments of information gathered throughout the day. Each thought may seem small on its own, yet together they create a continuous stream of internal commentary. Within that stream, the mind often becomes crowded, as if too many voices are speaking at once. Silence acts as a reset field within this environment, not the kind of silence where the world becomes empty, but the kind where the mind briefly stops pushing new thoughts forward. In that pause, something subtle happens inside the nervous system. Neural circuits that have been firing continuously begin slowing their activity. Stress signals reduce. The body shifts from a state of mental effort into a state of restoration. The brain, like every organ in the body, operates through cycles of activation and recovery. When attention focuses intensely on tasks or worries, neurons fire rapidly in coordinated patterns. These bursts of activity allow the brain to process information, but they also consume energy. Silence introduces a counterbalance to this process. When the mind stops generating constant commentary, the electrical activity of the brain becomes more organized and less demanding. Researchers studying brain rhythms often observe this shift when people enter states of quiet awareness. The fast beta waves associated with busy thinking begin to slow, giving way to alpha rhythms linked with relaxed attention. In deeper silence, Even slower theta waves appear, rhythms often associated with creativity, insight, and the integration of memory. These patterns suggest that silence is not the absence of mental activity, but a different quality of activity, one that allows the brain to reorganize itself. Consider how a lake behaves when strong winds disturb its surface. Waves scatter in multiple directions, reflecting fragments of light without clarity. The water still exists, yet its surface becomes chaotic. When the wind stops, the lake gradually settles. The surface becomes smooth, allowing the surrounding landscape to reflect clearly. The lake has not changed its nature, it has simply returned to a state of balance. The mind behaves in a remarkably similar way. When thoughts move rapidly and without pause, the surface of awareness becomes turbulent. Attention jumps from one idea to another, often without finishing any of them. Silence allows the turbulence to settle. Thoughts may still arise, but they appear more slowly, and the space between them becomes noticeable. In that space, the nervous system resets itself, the heart rate stabilizes, breathing deepens naturally. Muscles release subtle tension that may have gone unnoticed during periods of mental activity. Hormones associated with stress begin decreasing, while neurotransmitters linked with calm and focus become more available. The body does not require extraordinary effort to create these changes. It simply responds to the quieter rhythm of the mind. What makes silence particularly powerful is that it allows the brain to integrate experiences that were previously scattered across different circuits. Throughout the day, the mind absorbs enormous amounts of information, conversations, images, decisions, emotional reactions. When thinking remains constant, the brain rarely has time to organize these experiences. Silence provides the interval where integration can occur. Neural networks communicate more effectively, connecting insights that might otherwise remain separate. This is one reason creative ideas often appear during moments of quiet rather than during periods of intense effort. When the mind stops forcing solutions, previously unrelated neural circuits have the opportunity to interact. Patterns emerge that were hidden within the noise of continuous thinking. Silence also changes the relationship you have with your own thoughts. When the mind moves rapidly, it is easy to believe that every thought demands attention. A worry appears and immediately becomes a problem to analyze. A memory surfaces and becomes a story to replay. In silence, you begin noticing something different. Thoughts still arise, yet they can pass without pulling your attention with them. They become events moving through awareness rather than commands that must be followed. This realization gradually alters how the mind operates during the rest of the day. Once you experience the stability that silence provides, the constant rush of internal commentary begins to feel unnecessary. You may still think, plan, and analyze when needed, but the mind learns that it does not have to remain active every moment. Periods of quiet become part of the natural rhythm of mental life. Modern environments often make silence seem rare because information surrounds us constantly. Notifications, conversation, music, and screens filling every available space. Yet silence does not require a remote mountain or an empty room. It can appear in small intervals throughout the day. A few slow breaths before responding to a message, a short walk without headphones, a moment of simply observing the movement of the body while standing still. During these intervals, the brain receives a signal that it can pause its constant processing. Neural circuits settle, and the nervous system recalibrates. The more frequently these pauses occur, the easier it becomes for the mind to return to them. Over time, silence begins to function like a field within which thoughts appear and disappear, rather than a rare event that interrupts them. The mind becomes less crowded, and attention gains a steadiness that allows ideas to unfold with greater clarity. Instead of competing with countless internal voices, a single thought can develop fully before the next one arrives. This shift does not remove the complexity of life or eliminate the responsibilities that require careful thinking. What changes is the background environment in which thinking occurs. When silence becomes familiar, the mind no longer operates under constant pressure. It gains the ability to move between activity and stillness, using energy when necessary and restoring it when possible. Within that rhythm, the nervous system functions more efficiently. The brain processes information with greater clarity, and awareness begins to feel less like a crowded intersection of thoughts and more like an open landscape, where ideas can move freely without overwhelming the space that holds them. Notice something simple for a moment. When you remember a joyful event from years ago, your body responds almost instantly. Your face may soften, your chest may feel lighter, and your breathing becomes deeper without you consciously deciding to change it. Now notice the opposite. When you recall an uncomfortable memory, a moment of embarrassment, rejection, or fear, the body reacts just as quickly. Your stomach tightens, your shoulders rise slightly, and your breathing becomes shorter. The event itself is not happening in the present moment. Yet the body behaves as if the memory still carries physical weight. What this reveals is something deeply important. Memories are not stored only in the mind as abstract images. They are also encoded within the body through patterns of emotion and chemistry. When an experience occurs, the brain records information about the event, the sights, sounds, and sequence of what happened. But at the same time, the body records the emotional state that accompanied the event. Hormones are released, muscles react, and neural circuits form connections between the emotional response and the situation that triggered it. Over time, these patterns become part of the nervous system's memory. Scientists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as emotional memory. The brain structures most involved in it include the amygdala, hippocampus, and parts of the limbic system, which work together to associate emotional intensity with specific experiences. When the brain detects a situation that resembles a past event, these systems can reactivate the emotional response almost immediately. Yet the story does not end in the brain. Every emotional reaction triggers chemical signals that travel throughout the body. Hormones such as adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, and oxytocin circulate through the bloodstream, interacting with receptors in tissues and organs. These signals influence heart rhythm, digestion, muscle tension, immune function, and even gene expression. In other words, emotional experiences become biological events affecting the entire body. When certain emotional patterns repeat over long periods, the body begins adapting to them. Cells adjust their sensitivity to particular chemical signals. Neural pathways strengthen the connection between certain thoughts and physical responses. Muscles may remain slightly tense even during moments of rest because the nervous system has become accustomed to preparing for stress. This is why emotions sometimes feel as though they live in the body rather than simply passing through the mind. A person who has experienced repeated stress may notice persistent tightness in the shoulders. Someone who carries unresolved grief may feel a heaviness in the heart area or a tendency toward deep sighing breaths. These sensations are not imaginary. They are physical echoes of emotional patterns that have been reinforced within the nervous system. The body becomes, in a sense, a living archive of emotional experience. However, it is important to understand that the body does not store memories in the same way a computer stores files. Cells do not hold detailed images of past events. Instead, they retain patterns, chemical tendencies, muscular habits, and neural responses that were formed during emotionally significant moments. When similar situations arise, these patterns activate again, recreating familiar feelings. You might notice this when entering an environment that reminds you of something from the past, perhaps a particular tone of voice, a certain kind of conversation, or even a specific smell triggers an emotional reaction before you fully understand why. The body recognizes the pattern before the conscious mind analyzes it. The nervous system responds quickly because it has learned that certain signals were once important for survival or emotional protection. Yet the body's ability to store emotional patterns also means it has the ability to change them. Just as emotional responses become embedded through repetition, they can gradually shift through new experiences that introduce different patterns of chemistry and movement. When the nervous system encounters calm situations repeatedly, it begins forming new associations between events and emotional states. Over time, the body learns that not every similar situation requires the same defensive response. One pathway for this transformation involves awareness of bodily sensations. When you notice tension in the body without immediately reacting to it, the nervous system receives a signal that the sensation does not necessarily require escalation. Slow breathing, relaxed posture, and gentle attention to physical sensations allow stress-related circuits to settle rather than intensify. Another pathway involves generating emotional states that counterbalance older patterns. Feelings such as gratitude, appreciation, or compassion activate chemical signals very different from those associated with fear or anger. These chemicals interact with the body's receptors and gradually teach cells that alternative emotional environments are possible. For example, gratitude has been shown to influence heart rhythms and reduce stress hormone levels. When the body experiences these states repeatedly, the nervous system begins associating certain thoughts or situations with calm rather than tension. The old emotional memory does not disappear instantly, but it becomes less dominant because new patterns are forming alongside it. This process resembles learning a new physical movement. When someone practices a sport or musical instrument, muscles and neural circuits gradually adapt to support the repeated action. At first, the movement feels unfamiliar and requires conscious attention. With repetition, it becomes natural because the body has reorganized itself around the new pattern. Emotional patterns evolve in much the same way. A person who has spent years reacting to stress with tension may initially find it difficult to relax the body during challenging moments. The nervous system is simply following the patterns it knows best. But with consistent practice, pausing, breathing slowly, observing sensations without immediate reaction, the body begins recognizing that another response is available. Over time, the emotional memory encoded in the body becomes more flexible. Situations that once triggered immediate physical tension may now evoke only a mild reaction that passes quickly. The nervous system becomes capable of experiencing emotion without becoming trapped in the same cycles that once dominated its responses. This transformation does not require erasing the past. Emotional memories remain part of the brain's history. Just as physical scars remain part of the body's history, what changes is the intensity with which those memories influence the present moment. As new patterns form, the nervous system gains the ability to experience a wider range of emotional states without being confined to the reactions learned long ago. The body continues carrying traces of past experiences, yet it also continues learning from every moment that unfolds. Each breath, each sensation, each emotional state contributes another layer to the ongoing dialogue between mind and body. Within that dialogue, the memories held in cells slowly reorganize themselves, responding not only to what has happened before, but also to the patterns of awareness and emotion that shape the present. There are moments when an emotion rises inside you so suddenly that it feels as if it appeared from nowhere. A wave of irritation during a simple conversation, a quiet sadness that emerges while doing something ordinary, a tightness in the chest when you read a message that seems harmless on the surface. In those moments, the reaction often feels immediate and personal, as though the situation in front of you is the sole cause of the feeling. Yet, when you look more closely, you begin noticing that emotions sometimes carry echoes from experiences that happened long before the present moment. What appears as a reaction to today's event may actually be the nervous system recognizing a pattern that resembles something stored in the past. Earlier, we spoke about how the body carries emotional memories through neural connections and chemical patterns. These memories do not remain locked away in isolation. They are constantly interacting with new experiences. When the brain detects similarities between a current situation and a previous emotional event, it can activate the same pattern of response. The body reacts quickly because it believes it has already learned something important about this kind of moment. But here is where awareness becomes essential. When an emotion appears, the mind often moves immediately into analysis or resistance. You may try to push the feeling away, criticize yourself for having it, or search for explanations about why it should not be there. Ironically, this reaction can strengthen the emotional imprint rather than dissolve it. The nervous system interprets resistance as additional stress, which reinforces the same circuits that produced the emotion in the first place. Observing the emotion, instead of fighting it, introduces a completely different process. Observation begins with a simple shift in attention. Instead of identifying completely with the feeling, you notice it as an experience moving through the body. You might sense where the emotion appears physically. Perhaps it feels like pressure in the chest, warmth in the face, or tension in the stomach. The moment you begin observing the sensation with curiosity rather than resistance, the nervous system receives a different signal. The brain realizes that the sensation is being noticed without immediate danger. This awareness interrupts the automatic cycle of reaction. The emotional imprint may still be present, but it is no longer expanding through continuous mental commentary. Instead of generating new thoughts that amplify the feeling, the mind becomes interested in the experience itself. The body remains active, yet the emotional wave begins losing the reinforcement that would normally keep it alive. Allowing the emotion to exist is the second step in this process. Allowing does not mean encouraging the emotion or acting on it impulsively. It simply means permitting the sensation to move through the body without trying to force it away. Emotions are biological events. They are composed of chemical signals that rise, circulate, and eventually dissolve if they are not continually reactivated by thoughts. When you allow the sensation to remain present for a short time, something interesting often happens. The intensity begins changing on its own. The tightness may soften slightly. The warmth may spread and then fade. Breathing becomes easier. What once felt solid and overwhelming reveals itself as a dynamic process that naturally evolves. Many emotional imprints persist, not because they are permanent, but because the mind keeps reactivating them. Each time a thought revisits the same story, this shouldn't have happened. Why did they say that? What if this goes wrong? The brain releases another round of chemical signals that reinforce the emotional state. Observation and allowing interrupt this repetition. Releasing occurs naturally once the emotional cycle is no longer being reinforced. Think of the emotional system like a wave in the ocean. When wind continues blowing across the surface, waves grow larger and persist longer. When the wind stops, the water gradually returns to calm. Emotional waves behave similarly. Thoughts and resistance act like wind, continuously pushing the wave forward. Observation and allowing remove the wind. At first, the mind may feel uncomfortable with this approach. It is accustomed to solving emotional discomfort by analyzing it, fixing it, or escaping from it. Watching an emotion without interfering may seem passive or unfamiliar, yet this stillness allows the body's natural regulatory systems to function more effectively. Within the nervous system, there are networks designed specifically to restore balance after emotional activation. The parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system slows heart rate, relaxes muscles, and stabilizes breathing. These systems activate more easily when the mind is not constantly re-triggering stress responses. In other words, the body already knows how to release emotional tension when given the opportunity. You may notice that emotions, when allowed to move freely, often follow a simple arc. They rise, reach a peak, and gradually dissolve. The entire process can take only a few minutes if it is not interrupted by additional mental activity. During this time, the brain processes the emotional information, integrates it with existing memory, and restores equilibrium within the nervous system. This process also changes the relationship you have with your emotions. Instead of viewing them as problems that must be solved immediately, you begin recognizing them as signals passing through awareness. Each emotion contains information about the body's response to experience. When observed calmly, that information becomes easier to understand without becoming overwhelming. Over time, repeated observation and allowing begin weakening the intensity of older emotional imprints. The brain learns that not every trigger requires the same response it once produced. Neural circuits that once fired automatically begin slowing down because they are no longer reinforced by constant reaction. New pathways form that support calm attention rather than emotional escalation. This transformation rarely happens in dramatic moments. More often, it unfolds quietly through small experiences of awareness, pausing during a difficult conversation, noticing tension during a stressful task, or observing sadness without immediately trying to explain it. Each of these moments teaches the nervous system that emotional waves can move through the body without dominating the entire mind. Gradually, the space between stimulus and reaction becomes wider. In that space, you discover that emotions do not control the entire landscape of awareness. They appear, they move, and they dissolve, leaving behind a clearer sense of presence. Through observing, allowing, and releasing, the emotional imprints carried within the body begin losing their rigid influence. The nervous system learns that past patterns do not need to dictate every response in the present. And as those patterns loosen their grip, awareness becomes a quieter place where feelings can pass through without permanently shaping the state of the mind. Look carefully at your day. Not at the dramatic moments, but at the quiet, ordinary ones that seem too small to matter. The way you sit when you begin working, the tone of the first sentence you say to someone in the morning, the way your mind reacts when a minor inconvenience appears. These moments are so subtle that they rarely feel connected to anything important. Yet over time, they quietly shape something far larger than the moment itself. They shape identity. Most people think identity is a fixed description of who they are. They might say, I am a stressed person, or I am someone who overthinks. or "I'm just not very disciplined." These statements feel like observations, as if they describe permanent characteristics. But when you examine identity closely, you discover something surprising. Identity is not built from one large decision or one dramatic transformation. It is built from patterns repeated across thousands of small actions. The brain organizes itself around repetition. Neural pathways strengthen when they are used frequently, and the mind begins interpreting those repeated behaviors as evidence of who you are. If a person reacts to challenges with frustration over and over again, the brain begins associating frustration with their identity. If another person repeatedly pauses, breathes, and responds calmly, the brain begins associating steadiness with their identity. Identity, in this sense, is the story the nervous system tells itself about the patterns it experiences most often. This is where micro-habits enter the picture. Micro-habits are small, almost effortless actions that occur consistently throughout daily life. They do not require extraordinary motivation or intense discipline. Instead, they rely on repetition so subtle that the mind barely resists them. Yet, because they occur frequently, they gradually reshape the neural patterns supporting behavior and perception. Consider something simple: the first breath you take when you notice stress rising. Many people react automatically when tension appears. The shoulders tighten, the mind begins racing, and the body prepares for conflict. Now imagine inserting a micro-habit into that moment, a slow breath taken deliberately before responding. It lasts only a few seconds. On its own, it seems insignificant, but each time this small pause occurs, the brain records a new pattern. Stress appears. Breathing slows. The body remains stable. After dozens or hundreds of repetitions, this pattern becomes familiar to the nervous system. The brain begins expecting the pause before reaction. What once required conscious effort slowly becomes the default response. Micro-habits function like tiny adjustments to the direction of a river. One individual adjustment may seem too small to change the current. Yet, if the same adjustment occurs repeatedly, the flow of water gradually shifts. Over time, the river moves along a slightly different path. The same principle applies to identity. When someone repeatedly practices small habits of awareness, the brain begins associating those habits with the person's sense of self. Instead of seeing themselves as someone overwhelmed by emotions, they begin seeing themselves as someone who notices emotions and responds thoughtfully. Instead of believing they are constantly distracted, they begin recognizing that they are capable of returning attention to the present moment. These changes do not happen through grand declarations. The brain rarely reorganizes itself because of a single inspiring idea. It reorganizes itself through patterns that are repeated often enough to become familiar. Micro-habits are particularly effective because they reduce resistance. Large changes often trigger internal debate. The mind questions whether the effort is sustainable or whether failure is likely. Small habits avoid this problem because they feel manageable. A single mindful breath, a brief pause before speaking, or a moment of gratitude before sleep does not feel overwhelming. Yet when these actions appear every day, they accumulate into meaningful shifts in neural organization. Another advantage of micro-habits is their ability to anchor new patterns in specific situations. For example, someone might create a habit of relaxing their shoulders each time they sit down at a desk. At first, this action feels intentional, but after enough repetitions, the brain links the two events together. Sitting down automatically triggers relaxation rather than tension. These associations gradually reshape how the nervous system responds to everyday environments. The transformation may seem almost invisible at first. Days pass without dramatic breakthroughs, yet subtle differences begin appearing. Stressful situations that once triggered immediate reaction now include a brief moment of awareness. Conversations unfold with slightly more patience. The mind returns to calm more quickly after unexpected disturbances. These small changes are not isolated improvements. They represent shifts in the brain's underlying circuitry. Each repetition strengthens pathways associated with the new behavior, while older pathways lose some of their influence simply because they are used less frequently. Over time, the accumulation of micro-habits creates a new internal narrative about who you are. Identity becomes less defined by past patterns and more defined by the actions you repeat now. The brain does not distinguish between behaviors that occur intentionally and behaviors that occur automatically. It simply recognizes which patterns appear most often. This is why identity transformation often feels gradual rather than sudden. There may not be a single moment where everything changes. Instead, there are countless small moments where attention returns to the chosen habit. Each return reinforces the neural circuits supporting that behavior. Eventually, the person begins noticing something different in their daily experience. Situations that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable. Emotional reactions still appear, but they pass more quickly because the body has learned new ways of responding. The mind becomes less reactive, not because emotions disappear, but because the nervous system now has alternative patterns available. The most interesting aspect of this process is that identity begins shifting without the need for constant self-evaluation. The brain gradually updates its internal model of the self based on repeated evidence. When the evidence consistently shows calm responses, mindful pauses, and deliberate attention, the nervous system naturally begins recognizing those patterns as part of who you are. Microhabits therefore operate quietly beneath the surface of daily life. They do not demand dramatic effort or constant reflection. They simply repeat, shaping neural pathways with each occurrence. In doing so, they slowly reorganize the architecture of identity itself, guiding the mind and body toward patterns that once seemed difficult but now feel entirely natural. Watch how most days actually begin, not in the grand events that fill calendars, but in the quiet seconds before the world asks anything from you. Eyes open, the mind begins moving almost immediately. Thoughts about unfinished work, messages waiting on a phone, plans that must be organized, small worries that quietly step forward before the body has even left the bed. The day starts, and the mind accelerates without ever asking whether the direction it has chosen is useful. Yet there is something important hidden in that first stretch of awareness each morning. The nervous system is extremely receptive during those early moments. The brain is transitioning from slower sleep rhythms into the faster patterns associated with alert thinking. During this transition, the signals that appear in the mind can influence how the nervous system organizes the next several hours of experience. What you place into attention during that brief window often becomes the tone of the day. Morning alignment begins with recognizing this opening rather than rushing past it. Instead of allowing the first thoughts to scatter in every direction, you introduce a small moment of orientation, not a long ritual or a complicated practice, but a deliberate pause. The body is still, the breathing remains natural, and awareness gently returns to something simple, the fact that a new day has begun. The nervous system receives this pause as a signal that the mind is not immediately entering stress mode. Heart rhythm stabilizes, breathing deepens slightly, and the brain begins organizing itself around calm attention rather than urgency. This alignment does not require positive affirmations or elaborate mental exercises. It can be as simple as a quiet recognition of presence, feeling the breath move through the chest, noticing the weight of the body against the mattress or the floor, allowing the mind to wake gradually instead of pushing it immediately toward problem solving. When this brief alignment becomes a daily habit, the brain begins associating the morning with clarity rather than pressure. The nervous system learns that the day can begin from steadiness rather than reaction. Over time, this subtle change influences how the mind approaches the hours that follow. But even with a calm beginning, life inevitably introduces moments of tension. Conversations become complicated. Responsibilities pile up. Unexpected events disturb carefully planned schedules. The nervous system responds quickly to these situations because it evolved to detect and react to potential challenges. When stress appears, breathing often becomes shallow and irregular without the person even noticing. This is where the breath reset becomes a powerful tool. Breathing is unique among bodily processes because it operates both automatically and consciously. Most of the time, the brain regulates breathing without effort, adjusting the rhythm according to the body's needs. Yet at any moment, you can take control of the breath intentionally. When you slow the breath, deliberately lengthening the exhale and allowing the inhale to follow naturally, the nervous system receives an immediate message that the body is safe. Within seconds, the heart rate begins adjusting to match the new breathing rhythm. The vagus nerve, one of the main communication pathways between the brain and body, activates calming responses throughout the nervous system. Stress hormones begin decreasing, and muscles release tension that had been building quietly beneath awareness. A breath reset does not remove the challenge that triggered stress. What it changes is the internal environment from which you respond to that challenge. Instead of reacting from a state of agitation, the brain regains access to its more thoughtful and creative capacities. Decisions become clearer because the nervous system is no longer overwhelmed by urgency. The remarkable aspect of this process is how quickly the body responds. Just a few slow breaths can shift the entire physiological state. The brain begins synchronizing with the heart's rhythm, and neural circuits associated with calm attention regain influence over emotional reactions. Over time, the nervous system learns to associate stressful moments with the opportunity to reset rather than escalate. Morning alignment sets the tone for awareness. Breath reset restores balance during the day. Night gratitude completes the cycle. As the day comes to an end, the mind often continues replaying events long after the body is ready for rest. Conversations are analyzed again. Mistakes are revisited. Plans for tomorrow begin forming before sleep arrives. The nervous system, still active from the day's experiences, may struggle to settle into the slower rhythms required for deep rest. Gratitude acts as a gentle transition between activity and restoration. When attention turns toward moments that brought value during the day, perhaps a conversation, a small success, or even a quiet moment of peace, the emotional chemistry of the body shifts. Gratitude stimulates neural circuits associated with appreciation and connection. The heart rhythm becomes more coherent, and the brain reduces its production of stress-related signals. This shift is not about ignoring difficulties or pretending the day contained no challenges. Instead, it invites the mind to recognize that alongside challenges, there were also moments worth acknowledging. By focusing attention on these moments, the nervous system learns to close the day from a state of balance rather than tension. As gratitude settles into awareness, breathing naturally slows. Muscles release the subtle effort they have been carrying throughout the day. The brain transitions toward the slower wave patterns that support deep sleep and memory integration. Experiences from the day begin organizing themselves within neural networks, strengthening useful insights while allowing unnecessary stress to dissolve. Over time, this rhythm-morning alignment, breath reset, night gratitude creates a stable cycle within the nervous system. The day begins with awareness rather than urgency, navigates challenges with the ability to recalibrate through breath, and ends with a sense of completion rather than lingering agitation. The practices themselves remain simple, almost invisible within the larger structure of life, yet their repetition gradually teaches the brain and body a different rhythm of living. Instead of moving from stress to stress without pause, the nervous system learns to return repeatedly to states of balance, and within that rhythm, the day unfolds with a steadiness that quietly influences every thought, every reaction, and every moment of awareness that follows. Look closely at how a human life usually unfolds, and you begin noticing something curious. From childhood onward, the mind is gradually trained to interpret the world through patterns that are repeated again and again. Parents explain how things work. Schools teach what is considered correct or incorrect. Society reinforces certain behaviors and discourages others. None of this is inherently wrong. In fact, much of it is necessary for people to function together within complex communities. Yet alongside these useful lessons, another process quietly develops: conditioning. Conditioning shapes how the mind reacts long before awareness has the chance to examine those reactions. You learn what success is supposed to look like, what failure means, what emotions are acceptable to show, and which ones should remain hidden. Over time, these repeated messages become internal rules that operate automatically. The mind begins interpreting experiences according to those rules without questioning where they originated. Imagine someone who was repeatedly told that mistakes are signs of weakness. Years later, whenever that person encounters difficulty, the body may respond with tension and self-criticism before conscious thought even begins. The nervous system reacts not simply to the situation itself, but to the conditioned meaning attached to it. Another person raised with the idea that mistakes are opportunities to learn may experience the same situation with curiosity rather than shame. The external event remains identical. The internal conditioning changes the entire emotional landscape. This is how human conditioning works. It programs the nervous system to respond in familiar ways based on patterns learned in the past. Yet beneath this layer of conditioning, there exists something deeper that many people rarely notice. Beneath the learned interpretations, beneath the stories about who you are and how life should unfold, there is a more direct way of experiencing reality. This level is not defined by inherited beliefs or social expectations. It is defined by awareness itself, an awareness capable of sensing the subtle energy moving through the body and the environment. Energetic awareness begins when attention shifts from the constant stream of interpretation to the immediate experience of being alive. Instead of focusing only on the thoughts, explaining a situation, you begin noticing the sensations within the body, the movement of breath, the rhythm of the heartbeat, the subtle currents of tension and relaxation that change from moment to moment. At first, these sensations may seem insignificant because the mind is accustomed to prioritizing thoughts. Yet the body is continuously processing information through electrical and chemical signals that shape how experiences unfold. The nervous system detects changes in temperature, posture, facial expression, tone of voice, and countless other signals before the conscious mind fully interprets them. Energetic awareness simply means becoming sensitive to this level of experience, when attention rests on bodily sensation rather than mental commentary. Something interesting begins happening. The space between stimulus and reaction becomes easier to notice. Instead of responding immediately according to old patterns, the nervous system pauses just long enough for awareness to recognize what is occurring. Within that pause, the conditioning that once seemed automatic begins revealing itself. You might notice the moment when irritation begins forming in the chest before words leave your mouth. You might feel a tightening in the stomach when a familiar worry appears. You might observe the quick surge of excitement when praise arrives, or the sudden heaviness when criticism appears. These sensations represent the energetic signatures of emotional reactions before they fully develop into behaviors. When these signals become visible to awareness, they no longer operate entirely outside of choice. This does not mean conditioning disappears immediately. The patterns built over years or decades continue influencing the nervous system. However, energetic awareness introduces a new relationship with those patterns. Instead of being unconsciously driven by them, you begin witnessing how they arise within the body. Think of conditioning as a script the nervous system has learned to follow. When awareness is absent, the script plays automatically. But when energetic awareness enters the process, you can see the script appearing before it finishes unfolding. The reaction becomes something you observe rather than something that completely controls your response. This shift often feels subtle at first. The body still reacts quickly because its conditioning developed through long repetition. Yet each moment of awareness creates a small opening where a different response becomes possible. Over time, these openings appear more frequently because the brain begins recognizing that awareness itself is part of the experience. Another interesting change occurs as energetic awareness deepens. The mind becomes less dominated by constant interpretation. Instead of immediately labeling experiences as good or bad, success or failure, awareness begins sensing them as movements of energy within the body. Emotions appear as waves of sensation rather than fixed identities. For example, anxiety may feel like quick movements of energy in the chest and throat. Excitement may appear as warmth and expansion through the body. Sadness may manifest as heaviness in the heart area or slower breathing. By noticing these sensations directly, the mind learns that emotions are dynamic processes rather than permanent states. This understanding reduces the intensity with which conditioning controls behavior. When emotions are seen as energy moving through the body, they become easier to experience without immediately reacting. The nervous system learns that sensations can rise and fall naturally without needing to be suppressed or acted upon instantly. Over time, energetic awareness also changes how you perceive other people and environments. You begin noticing the subtle emotional atmosphere within conversations. The tone of a room becomes visible not only through words but through posture, breathing, and rhythm of speech. Awareness expands beyond personal reactions to include the broader field of energy present in each interaction. This sensitivity does not make life more complicated. In many ways, it simplifies experience because you are no longer interpreting every situation through layers of inherited belief. Instead, you sense directly what is happening in the present moment. Conditioning still exists, but it no longer defines the entire landscape of awareness. Gradually, the nervous system learns to operate from this deeper level of perception. Old patterns may still appear, yet they pass through awareness without dominating it completely. The body continues responding to the world, but those responses become more fluid and less confined by past conditioning. The transition from human conditioning to energetic awareness is not about rejecting everything learned in life. Many forms of conditioning remain useful for navigating society and maintaining relationships. The shift simply introduces a wider perspective, one where the mind recognizes that behind every learned reaction there exists a deeper layer of awareness capable of observing the movement of thoughts. emotions, and sensations as they unfold. Within that layer, experience becomes less about repeating inherited patterns and more about noticing the subtle energy that moves through each moment of being alive. There is a moment you may have noticed before without giving it much importance. It happens when you walk into a place where someone has been calm and focused for a long time. The room feels different. Nothing dramatic has changed, no visible light, no sound that clearly explains the shift. Yet something about the atmosphere carries a quiet steadiness. Your breathing slows slightly. Your thoughts feel less scattered. Without anyone saying a word, the nervous system senses a different kind of order in the environment. Experiences like this reveal something subtle about human presence. Every person carries an energetic field shaped by their nervous system, their emotional state, and the electrical rhythms of the heart and brain. These signals are not mystical forces floating in space. They are measurable biological phenomena. The body generates electromagnetic activity continuously, and this activity changes according to the emotional and mental states we inhabit. When someone is anxious, the rhythm of their heart becomes irregular, and the signals traveling through the nervous system scatter. When someone is calm and coherent, those rhythms become smooth and synchronized, producing a more stable energetic pattern around the body. Most people move through life without noticing this field because attention remains focused almost entirely on external events and internal thoughts. Yet when awareness becomes quieter, as we explored in earlier parts, the subtle influence of this field becomes easier to perceive. You begin sensing how your emotional state shapes the atmosphere of your own experience and influences how others respond to you. Entering the field begins with becoming aware of the space inside your body rather than only the thoughts moving through your mind. Instead of allowing attention to rush immediately toward problems or plans, you pause and notice the physical center of your experience. The breath moves through the chest. The heart beats steadily. Muscles hold the structure of the body upright. Within this awareness, the mind gradually shifts from scattered thinking to embodied presence. The nervous system begins synchronizing its rhythms, and the electrical signals produced by the brain and heart become more coherent. This shift may feel simple, yet it changes the entire internal environment. The brain stops operating in fragmented bursts of attention and instead begins coordinating activity across different neural networks. Heart rhythm stabilizes, breathing deepens, and the body moves from defensive alertness toward balanced readiness. When this state becomes familiar, you are no longer just thinking about your experience, you are inhabiting it. Charging the field happens when emotional intention enters this state of coherence. Emotions are powerful regulators of the body's electrical and chemical systems. A feeling such as gratitude, appreciation, or quiet confidence produces a measurable pattern in heart rhythms that influences the brain's activity. When these emotions appear while the mind is calm and attentive, they amplify the coherence already forming within the nervous system. Imagine the difference between a mind that tries to force positivity while still feeling tense and scattered, and a mind that first settles into calm awareness before allowing gratitude to emerge naturally. In the first case, the nervous system remains conflicted. The emotional message does not fully reach the body. In the second case, the emotion spreads through an already stable system, influencing heart rhythm, breathing, and neural activity simultaneously. Charging the field, therefore, does not involve repeating words or convincing yourself of something artificial. It involves allowing a genuine emotional tone to fill the coherent space created by awareness. When appreciation or calm confidence appears within that space, the body begins broadcasting a more stable pattern of energy through its electromagnetic signals. This state changes how the nervous system interacts with the world. Other people unconsciously sense the steadiness in your presence. Conversations often become more balanced because the nervous system of the other person responds to signals of safety rather than tension. Even your own perception of events shifts because the brain interprets information differently when it receives coherent signals from the heart and body. Directing the field becomes possible once you recognize that attention and emotion together shape the energetic patterns within your body. Wherever attention goes, neural activity follows. When attention rests on calm breathing or meaningful intention, the brain reinforces circuits associated with those states. When emotional coherence accompanies that attention, the signals traveling through the nervous system gain strength and stability. Directing the field does not mean controlling every circumstance around you. Life remains unpredictable, and events unfold beyond anyone's personal influence. What directing the field means is choosing the internal state from which you meet those events. Imagine facing a difficult conversation. If the nervous system is filled with agitation, the field you carry into that conversation reflects tension. Words may come out more sharply than intended, and the other person's defensive reactions may escalate the situation. Now imagine entering the same conversation after a few moments of coherent breathing and emotional steadiness. The words may be similar, yet the tone changes. The nervous system communicates stability, and the interaction unfolds differently. This difference illustrates how directing the field influences real-life situations without requiring external force. The practice becomes easier with repetition. Each time you pause, settle attention in the body. Allow coherent emotion to emerge, and move through the world from that state. The brain records the experience. Neural circuits associated with calm focus strengthen. The heart becomes more efficient at maintaining coherent rhythms. Over time, the nervous system learns that this balanced state is not unusual. It becomes familiar. Gradually, the field you carry into daily life stabilizes. Instead of fluctuating constantly according to external circumstances, the nervous system maintains coherence more easily. Stressful situations may still appear, but the body returns to equilibrium faster because the underlying rhythm has changed. Entering, charging, and directing the field therefore becomes less about performing a technique and more about inhabiting a state of presence. Attention rests within the body. Emotion aligns with steadiness. The nervous system broadcasts a pattern of coherence that influences how experience unfolds moment by moment. Within that alignment, awareness moves through the world with a different quality, less driven by unconscious reaction and more guided by the quiet stability of a nervous system that has learned how to organize its energy with intention. Many people spend years trying to change their lives by constantly chasing new outcomes: a different career, a better relationship, more success, more recognition, more stability, more control. The mind becomes convinced that fulfillment exists somewhere ahead, just beyond the next achievement or the next adjustment to circumstances. This belief quietly organizes the nervous system around a permanent sense of pursuit. Something is always missing. Something always needs improvement. And the present moment becomes merely a bridge to the future that is supposed to finally bring balance. Yet, when you examine this pattern carefully, something revealing begins to appear. Even when external situations improve, the internal state often remains the same. A person who once believed that success would remove their stress may discover that the stress simply follows them into the new environment. Someone who thought a relationship would bring emotional peace may notice that familiar insecurities reappear even when the relationship itself is supportive. The circumstances changed, yet the internal rhythm of the nervous system remained largely unchanged. This observation leads to a subtle but powerful realization. Life does not simply respond to what you want, it responds to the state from which you live. For many people, the habit of chasing change begins long before they are aware of it. The mind learns to measure life by comparison. Where am I compared to others? What have I achieved compared to what I expected? How far am I from the version of life I imagined? These comparisons produce a constant tension between the present moment and the imagined future. The nervous system interprets that tension as a signal that something is incomplete. Over time, this tension becomes normal. The body learns to operate in a state of subtle restlessness. Even when nothing is wrong, the mind continues searching for something to fix, something to improve, something to pursue. In this way, the pursuit of change becomes a habit rather than a conscious decision. But there is another possibility that begins to emerge when awareness deepens. Instead of organizing life around the constant pursuit of different circumstances, the nervous system can learn to stabilize itself first. When the internal rhythms of the heart, breath, and brain move into coherence, as we explored earlier, the body experiences a state of balance that does not depend entirely on external conditions. This balance does not eliminate challenges or remove uncertainty, but it changes the way those experiences are processed. From this perspective, the goal of transformation is not endless change. The goal is coherence. Coherence means the different systems within the body working in harmony rather than conflict. The heart rhythm becomes steady. Breathing follows a natural rhythm, and neural activity aligns with focused awareness instead of scattered reaction. When these systems synchronize, The mind experiences clarity rather than urgency. In such a state, something unexpected happens. The constant pressure to chase change begins to dissolve, not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because the nervous system no longer interprets every situation as a problem that must be solved immediately. Imagine standing beside a river that is moving wildly after heavy rain. The current is strong. Water rushes over rocks, and the entire surface appears chaotic. If you attempted to place something delicate in that river, it would be swept away instantly. Now imagine the same river when the water has settled into a steady flow. The current still moves, yet its movement is organized and predictable. Objects placed in the river travel smoothly rather than being thrown in every direction. The human nervous system behaves in a similar way. When internal rhythms are chaotic, every experience feels overwhelming. Small difficulties trigger large reactions. Decisions become rushed because the mind wants to escape the discomfort of uncertainty. In that state, people often chase external change, simply to reduce internal pressure. But when coherence develops within the body, the relationship with experience shifts. The mind no longer needs to escape every challenge because the internal environment remains stable. From that stability, decisions become clearer and actions become more deliberate. This is what it means to become coherence rather than chase change. The focus moves away from forcing life to become different and toward cultivating the internal state that allows life to unfold with greater clarity. The nervous system learns that calm attention is not something that appears only after success. It can exist as the foundation from which success, creativity, and connection emerge. Interestingly, when the body operates from coherence, change often occurs naturally. Conversations become more constructive because emotional reactions no longer dominate communication. Opportunities become easier to recognize because attention is not consumed by anxiety. Decisions align more closely with long-term intentions because the mind is not reacting impulsively to short-term discomfort. What once required effort begins happening through alignment. This does not mean life stops evolving. Circumstances will still shift, and growth will continue appearing in unexpected ways. The difference lies in the direction of movement. Instead of pushing outward constantly, trying to force reality into a preferred shape, awareness begins organizing inward first. The nervous system establishes coherence, and actions arise naturally from that state. People often describe this shift as feeling less like striving and more like flowing. Effort still exists where necessary, yet it is not driven by constant internal pressure. The body remains responsive rather than reactive, and the mind approaches challenges with curiosity rather than resistance. Gradually, the old habit of chasing change loses its influence. The nervous system recognizes that stability can exist even while life remains unpredictable. The present moment becomes less like a waiting room for the future and more like the place where clarity actually begins. When coherence becomes the foundation of awareness, life continues unfolding with its usual mixture of uncertainty and opportunity. The difference is that the mind no longer feels compelled to run ahead searching for balance somewhere else. The balance already exists within the rhythms of the body and the steadiness of attention that accompanies it. There comes a point in this journey where something quietly shifts inside you, and the shift is so subtle that at first you may not even recognize it as transformation. Nothing dramatic announces its arrival. The world outside still looks familiar. The responsibilities of daily life remain the same. Conversations still happen. Challenges still appear. And the rhythm of ordinary existence continues moving forward. Yet somewhere within the nervous system a new pattern has begun forming. And this pattern slowly changes the way experience unfolds. The change does not occur because a single powerful idea suddenly rewired the mind. It happens because hundreds of small moments of awareness have accumulated over time. Each pause before reaction, each breath that reset the nervous system, each moment of observing emotion rather than being carried away by it, these experiences gradually reshaped the brain's circuitry. Neural pathways that once dominated your reactions began losing strength, while new pathways supporting clarity, patience, and coherence slowly gained influence. The brain, after all, is not a fixed structure. It is a living network constantly reorganizing itself according to the patterns it repeats most often. When awareness enters those patterns consistently, the nervous system learns to operate differently. The mind that once reacted automatically begins recognizing space between stimulus and response. That space becomes the foundation of a new neural identity. Identity, in this sense, is not the collection of labels you once used to describe yourself. It is the rhythm of responses your nervous system produces when life unfolds. If those responses repeatedly arise from tension and fear, the brain learns that identity is built around defense. If those responses begin emerging from calm awareness and thoughtful action, the brain learns a different story about who you are. Over time, the body begins trusting this new rhythm. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional escalation now evoke a brief moment of stillness before reaction. The nervous system no longer assumes that every challenge is a threat requiring instant defense. Instead, it waits just long enough for awareness to recognize what is actually happening. That small pause changes everything, because within it, the brain has the opportunity to choose a response aligned with clarity rather than habit. This is the beginning of living as conscious creation. The phrase may sound abstract at first, yet its meaning is deeply practical. To live as conscious creation does not mean controlling every event or shaping reality according to personal desire. Life remains complex and unpredictable. What changes is the relationship between your internal state and the actions that emerge from it. When the nervous system operates from coherence, the brain becomes less reactive to external turbulence. Thoughts appear, but they no longer dominate awareness in the same way. Emotions arise, but they move through the body without dictating behavior. Attention remains anchored in the present moment, allowing decisions to form from a place of stability rather than urgency. In this state, creativity becomes easier because mental energy is no longer consumed by constant internal conflict. Ideas connect more naturally. Solutions appear with greater clarity. Even ordinary tasks begin feeling different because the mind approaches them with focused presence instead of restless distraction. Relationships also change within this new neural identity. When the nervous system is regulated, communication becomes more grounded. Words are chosen with greater care because the brain is not reacting impulsively to emotional triggers. Listening deepens because attention is not divided between the conversation and internal anxiety. Others often respond differently as well, sensing the steadiness in your presence, even if they cannot explain why. This shift does not mean life becomes permanently calm or free of difficulty. Moments of stress will still arise, and emotions will still move through the body as part of the human experience. The difference lies in how quickly the nervous system returns to coherence. Instead of remaining trapped in prolonged cycles of tension, awareness recognizes the disturbance and gradually guides the body back toward balance. The brain adapts to this rhythm just as it once adapted to older patterns. Neural networks supporting awareness strengthen each time they are used. The pathways connecting breath, emotion, and attention become more efficient. The heart and brain synchronize more easily because the body has practiced returning to that state repeatedly. Eventually, coherence feels less like a practice and more like the natural baseline of experience. At this stage, the idea of self begins changing as well. Instead of defining yourself by past reactions or fixed personality traits, identity becomes fluid and responsive. You recognize that the nervous system is capable of evolving continuously. The mind no longer feels locked into the patterns it learned earlier in life. Each moment offers the possibility of responding with awareness rather than repetition. Living as conscious creation, therefore, becomes less about changing the world outside and more about shaping the internal environment from which you engage with the world. When attention remains clear and the body remains coherent, actions arise from alignment rather than impulse. Over time, these actions influence the direction life takes. Not through force, but through consistency. You begin noticing that the quality of your presence shapes the quality of your experience. The nervous system you inhabit becomes the lens through which reality appears. When that system operates with balance, the world often reflects that balance in unexpected ways through clearer communication, wiser decisions, and opportunities that once went unnoticed. None of this requires perfection. The new neural identity does not mean you will never experience doubt, frustration, or uncertainty again. Those emotions remain part of the human landscape. What changes is your relationship with them. They no longer define who you are or dictate how every situation unfolds. Instead, they appear as temporary movements within a much larger field of awareness. And within that field, life continues unfolding moment by moment. Thoughts arise, emotions shift, circumstances evolve. Yet awareness remains present enough to witness the movement without losing itself inside it. The nervous system carries the memory of coherence, and from that memory, new responses continue emerging. This is how conscious creation expresses itself, not as control over every event, but as the quiet ability to meet each moment with a mind and body that have learned how to remain aligned while life moves forward.